There's a lot of videos out there about why and how you choose a solar system for your home. So I want to talk through some of the research I did and the thinking that went into how I chose to set mine up the way I did. And so if you think about a typical home, unless you're already off grid or something, most homes are connected to the utility company, or what's known as the grid. And the main driver in someone choosing to go to a solar or solar and battery system is really about how much you pay your utility for electricity. And you're trying to compare the cost of paying for a solar system relative to how much you pay for that electricity. So, and what's changed over the years is that the price of the solar panels has gone down dramatically, while the price of electricity in many states have gone up, at least in America. And so what used to be around a 20-year payback period for a solar investment now is something in the range of like 7 years. And that's even achievable if you pay maybe as little as $150 a month for electricity. And it gets even more attractive, obviously, if you pay more, whether you use more or you just have higher rates. So there's a couple different ways you can set it up, right? So a lot of people just get solar and they add that to their home and their which is connected to their home and obviously to the grid as well in many cases. And what's interesting for this setup too is that I didn't know this, but in a power outage, the solar actually doesn't work. So if you were to lose connectivity from the grid for whatever reason, it needs power to fire up the inverters, which convert the electricity, the energy from the solar into what the house can use. So I didn't realize that. Some people just get battery backup just for outage reasons. If they have like medical devices that need continuous power, so some people have that set up. And then I think more commonly, if they get a battery, they generally get it with solar. So this is the configuration I'm looking at, which is a solar and battery backup connected to the home and the grid. And so when you think about how do you configure this, you can go to the Tesla website at the URL here in blue, and you can go there and check this out yourself. So I cut this out so you can see it. So there's three main modes that you can set it up in once your system's been installed. And they have varying reasons why why you would choose them. For the one I'm talking about is the time-based control. So that's the one I will primarily use. And why did I choose that one? So there's two main reasons. One is that I have two electric vehicles, and the charging needs for those two are rather large. So that's one reason. The second reason is that for my state, California, in America, we're on what's known as a time of use electricity plan, and we can do what's called net metering, and I'll explain both a little bit later. But essentially, the time of use plan is a way to incentivize people to charge their electric vehicles when the demand on the utility companies is not so high. So, mainly in the early morning or nighttime periods, and in exchange you get a much cheaper rate for that. So if you think about my situation, my example, I have these two electric vehicles. One has a 75 kilowatt hour battery, one has a 100 kilowatt hour battery. So they're quite large, probably some of the largest that's available out there. So if you have, one electric vehicles or only plug-in hybrids with a much smaller battery capacity, then I think this will change your considerations for whether you would choose to do this or not. But for me, it's these two vehicles, and on a daily basis, we roughly charge between 50% and 70% of the battery. So within that range, covers most of our daily driving habits. Obviously, with exception to this particular time period where, during the pandemic, we're not driving as much. But in the normal course of the year, when we're going to work, we're using about this much to charge the car. So if you do the basic math here for both these batteries, charging 20%, it comes out to a need of about 35 kilowatt hours per day. So that's what we need to do the charging vehicles. Now, obviously, if you drive more, and like I said, you have different vehicles with different battery capacities, this calculation will change for you. So then we bring in our sources, our renewable source energies, which is really the solar and then the battery backup, the battery system. And you want to think about it in sort of two different aspects. So one is about solar production, how much you can produce in electricity, as well as how much the battery can store of that electricity for use later on in the nighttime. And the other one is throughput, how much power can you deliver in a continuous way, because it's, for solar, it's not all evenly generated right throughout the day. It's based on if a cloud's passing, whether if it's raining or whatever. So you break this down, already you can see there's a challenge, right? Just on how much production, right? On a daily basis, I said that I need 35 kilowatt hours of electricity, and my solar system is only sized to 30 kilowatt hours per day. So immediately that presents a problem. There's not enough to cover that. And I said, again, I'll get into why. I have a different video that explains why I chose to size it at roughly 30 kilowatt hours per day. And so, in terms of just that alone, it's going to be a problem. And then if you really think about it, I don't, on a normal course of a week, I'm not charging my car at home, right? If I'm at work, my car's at work. So I'm not using the solar during the day to charge the car. So I'm going to fill the battery. I'm going to mostly charge it at night. And one Powerwall only holds 13.5 kilowatt hours. So that isn't nearly enough to fulfill the charging needs on a daily basis, much less fill the entire battery. So, Powerwalls are really expensive, right? So one of them installed is like 10 grand. So $10,000, that's a lot. So it's not really cost efficient for me to buy multiple Powerwalls just to handle the charging. So already in this first aspect of the how much I can generate plus how much I can really draw from the storage, that's already kind of a blocker for me when it comes to electric vehicle charging. Then you think about throughput, right? Even if I were able to have enough solar generated, one Powerwall isn't enough. It only provides 5 kilowatt continuous power. It could peak at like 7 kilowatts, but again, I have to buy multiple Powerwalls to get the right charging rate for the vehicles to charge at night. So the throughput is also a bit of an issue. So what does this, also translate to? Like, is that enough, right? So you can check that by, the formula, how to calculate the amps of watts divided by volts. And so that calculation for the 5 kilowatt continuous power over a 220 volt hookup is 23 amps. So my wall connectors are on a 50 amp circuit. So you can see already that it's not going to be able to charge at the full rate, the full speed that I'd want it to. And if I did that, I wouldn't even have any left over for the house. So that's another challenge right there. So, what this all means is that, at least for this car charging, for the electric vehicle charging, I really should rely on the grid to provide this daily charging need. And then what I really would rely on the solar and the battery is to really power the rest of the house, as well as use it for net metering, and then also to have outage protection in the event of an electrical outage, right? So that's a frame up sort of why I chose to run it in this particular configuration, the time-based control. So net metering, I think many places have this concept, not just the United States or even California. And so what that means is my utility company, it's called PG&E, they will charge you different rates, different prices for electrical usage, dollars per kilowatt hours, based on the time of day, which really reflects the demand. The higher the demand, which is based on a time of day, the more expensive it gets. And so it's really to discourage people from all using the electricity at once. So you could see here at what they call the off-peak time, it's roughly 16 cents a kilowatt hour, and so that's usually when you use it for charging vehicles. That's what they're trying to drive that behavior. And then during the partial peak times, this is when usage is not its maximum, but it's still higher. It's it's like 30, 35, 36 cents per kilowatt hour. And then the highest here, the peak times, is when people come home, turn on their stoves, turn on their ACs or whatever. This is the highest usage during the day for the utility companies, and so you can see it's almost 50 cents per kilowatt hour, which is quite high. And then so what net metering does is, if you see this blue curve, this is roughly the shape of the solar production throughout the day. And so what it's going to do is it's going to send back electricity that it's producing from the solar back to the grid, back to the utility company, generally at the higher rates here in the peak and the partial peak times. As you can see, you get this leverage. You get credit at this price, at this higher price. Now, that's not the same for all states or utility companies. Some give you a discounted rate, so it's not as meaningful. But in California, at least, you get this rate that you pull it at. You get to get the credit at that rate. So if I push electricity back to the grid at this time period, I'm getting like a 2 or 3 to 1 kind of leverage on the electricity I would pull for charging the vehicles during the off-peak times. So that's how, in general, how net metering works. And then I also, I have a separate video that goes into much greater detail on the numbers and how I designed and sized my solar and battery system. So when you think about how it works together in the scenarios, Tesla has some pretty good videos about this, but I wanted to go through this in my own situation because there's some other learnings that I discovered in working with Tesla that the videos didn't quite explain. And so, if you think about the early mornings, sun hasn't come up yet, so you're primarily powering the house from your battery, from the Powerwall. So this is a very typical situation. But at any time, if your home requires more power for whatever reason and exceeds the battery throughput or its capacity, the grid will supply the difference. So that's how these work together. Now, as the sun rises, the solar production will kick in and it'll begin to power the house and then recharge the battery. So in the state of California, at least, you're not allowed to charge your Powerwall from the grid, with the exception of two situations. One is that if your system only has the battery, as in you didn't if you didn't install the solar. So if you only had the battery installed, then you're allowed to charge it from the grid, obviously, because you have no other way to charge it. And the second exception is that there's this thing called storm watch. So when there's a weather condition coming, like a hurricane or something, or there's an anticipated grid outage, like there's wildfires, then Tesla will push that change, and then in that situation you're allowed to pull the electricity from the grid to charge the battery if it's not full. So that doesn't sound like it's a technical reason. It's probably a policy reason why they do that. And so this is why when the solar kicks in, it's the only way you're charging the battery really is from that source versus the grid. And then just like any other time, like I said, if you're home because you're waking up in the morning, you're starting to turn a lot of electrical appliances on. If the house demands more power, then the grid will supply the difference. Now, this is actually probably more common for me because I set up my electrical vehicle charging to complete around the time in the morning that I leave, around 7:30 a.m., 7 a.m. So I want it to be ready at that state of charge as late as possible, closest to that 7:30 a.m. time. And again, in other videos you can look up, I explain why I do that. And so typically at this time of day, this configuration, this situation will be very likely because I'll be pulling from the grid to charge the vehicles. At the same time, the solar will be pitching in to help power some of that as well as charge the battery. And if you fast forward to later in the day, by this period, The solar's at its peak production at this time, and probably even earlier. The Powerwall's filled up to 100% by now. So the house is always on in terms of there's always something running, like a refrigerator or something like that. So the solar will continue to power the house, and then the excess will go to the grid, and it'll be selling it, back to the grid, the net metering at this time. And again, if you fast forward a little bit more, the partial peak time kicks in. This is when the demand goes up a little bit higher for the utility companies. So I'm still selling back to the grid to get a credit, but at a higher price, the partial peak price, while simultaneously still powering the house. And then when you get to the peak times, this is when I'm getting the maximum return for what I'm selling back to the grid while still powering the house. And again, to remind you, this behavior is based on me choosing the time-based control. The other settings will alter the behavior based on the conditions and your goals of whether you want a different behavior. And then later in the evening, when the sun sets, obviously the solar production stops, and then now you're going to be pulling power from the Powerwall to power your home. And the other thing I learned too is in the state of California, you're not allowed to net meter from your battery storage. So you can only do that from solar. I assume that's because they're trying to prevent you from, doing some kind of price arbitrage against the utility company. So you really can't. I'm sure there's technically you can do it, but I think by policy the software won't allow you to pull from the Powerwall, even though it's peak time right now and it's very advantageous to sell back to the grid. It won't allow you to do that. So really, when you do the calculation of how much money you can get by net metering, it's really within the confines, obviously, when you produce solar. So again, in the other video, I explain how Tesla calculates that and how that affects the price, the credits that you get back. And then ultimately, if you're doing stuff at night in terms of cooking or doing laundry, again, the grid kicks in if you need to do that, but generally you're trying to pull as much of that from the Powerwall as possible. And then at 12 a.m. midnight, that's when my time of use plan kicks in to go to off-peak again. And so, I can do laundry, because that uses quite a bit of energy. I'll set the dishwasher to run at this time. And then obviously I could charge the vehicles starting at midnight if I wanted to. So that's when the grid will likely kick in. But again, if you're not using that much, it'll just pull directly from the Powerwall. So this is, just a quick pass of sort of some of the learnings I got from doing the research and how I sized and how I chose my solar and battery configuration. I hope you found it useful. If so, please consider subscribing and hitting the like button. Like I said, I have other videos on how I size the system in more detail and the calculations that went behind it. So feel free to check that out. Thank you.